What's going on, y'all? There's been a lot of Deandre Ayton takes floating around out there on Twitter and whatnot recently. He's one of the most interesting free agents this offseason for sure. There's a lot of questions, a lot of things to talk about with him. Why aren't the Suns signing him? What's a sign and trade going to look like if that happens? Is he worth the max contract? Where's he going to go? So I wanted to make a video, talk a little bit about all that, some of my opinions on it. So why aren't the Phoenix Suns signing Deandre Ayton no matter what? They're a contending team. I know they lost in the second round. They're a contending team, though. For sure, if they let him walk, they're going to be worse. A sign and trade probably also makes them worse. Yeah, it might end up being expensive, but if you're a contending team, who cares about going to the luxury tax, right? Doesn't really make any sense. Like, yeah, maybe you agree that Ayton for the max is too much, but maybe for the Suns, that's their only option, and you're willing to take that risk considering, how good the team is. They were they had the most regular season wins. They were one game away from being in the Western Conference Finals. They were the finals year before. All reasonable. I think there's two main reasons why they aren't re-signing him. Number one is that the luxury tax is a big deal for them. I was talking about this all last video, but when you play 2K and you go over the luxury tax when you're in like my league or whatever, it makes no difference to you. Who cares, right? Because it doesn't actually affect your finances at all. From like a purely team building aspect, from a general manager aspect, it's not any different from being over the salary cap. But in real life, it does matter a lot. It gets really expensive. Teams are businesses. And even though they're a contending team, and this is true for every single team, it does matter at a point. Even the Golden State Warriors can only go into the luxury tax so much, and they're a contending team, and they're the richest franchise in the NBA. And I bet you this offseason, they're gonna have to make some tough decisions based purely off. They have an insane payroll, and they can only pay so much. Once you get high enough into the luxury tax, I think people don't realize it gets to be like you're paying $5 extra for every $1 that you're spending. The Suns already have $130 million in payroll. Even before they sign Ayton, a max would get them up to 160, and their roster wouldn't even be complete. Sarver, their owner, is not known for being the richest owner ever. And while, yeah, those guys do have ridiculous, stupid amounts of money, it's not infinite. NBA teams can lose money. The Nets lost money. So it matters. The other reason is that I think they just don't think he's worth the max. They don't trust him as a consistent offensive option. And there's very few guys in the NBA that are worth the max who aren't that. And while they definitely aren't unaware that he could continue to develop, they feel like he's not even reaching his full potential now with Chris Paul, who they feel like probably is a really good point guard to pair up with him. And they see that he's not aggressive in playoff games, and he doesn't take advantage of, what the Mavericks threw at him that series, especially when he doesn't stop teams from going smaller. It's like, I feel like the difference between, or what they feel like the difference between a replacement level center and what Ayton does is just not big enough to warrant a max contract. They don't want to lock themselves into that money. Whether or not that's fair, I think is interesting. And I don't necessarily blame them. I kind of agree. If a center can't expose the other team's mismatches and they can't stop the other team from going small ball, if your center can't expose the other team when they put out weak interior defenders, they may not be worth a max contract. I'm not saying I necessarily agree. I think I would re-sign Deandre Ayton regardless, even knowing how much it would cost. And I think I'd work out some other stuff. But I do understand where they're coming from. It's not completely senseless. And that raises the question, so what's a sign and trade going to look like then? Are they doing this because they think they're going to get a lot back in a sign and trade? And the answer is a sign and trade is probably going to look pretty bad, I think, for Phoenix. A lot of people seem to have the idea that because he's a restricted free agent, the Suns have control over where he's going to go more than Ayton does. And it'll lead to basically all the teams that want him sending trade packages to Phoenix, and they'll just take whichever one they like best and they'll make him go there. The problem with that is that even though he's a restricted free agent, that's not really how it works. Yes, it's true that the Suns can match any offer that Ayton might receive, but what they can't do is match an offer he gets from another team and then use that in a sign and trade to another team right then and there. That's not how it would work. A sign and trade is one big move that both the team and the player have to agree to, which is why they're kind of rare. Meaning that the leverage situation looks a lot more like Ayton is going to choose where he wants to play, and then the Suns will help facilitate a sign and trade because they do have a little leverage, him being a restricted free agent. And because also he might choose to go to a team that doesn't straight up have the salary cap to sign him, in which case the team that was trading for him would definitely need a sign and trade to go get him to make the money work. What that basically means is that the Suns have a lot less leverage than some people think they do, meaning that a sign and trade, and this is true for all sign and trade, is just not going to land them that much. They will be a worse team, right? Meaning that in a sign and trade, like all sign and trades, the team trading away the player doesn't really have all that much leverage. So if they got a solid role player out of this, I don't know if they'd feel terrible about it. If they got, a couple of decent guys, I don't know if they'd feel terrible about it. I don't know what the specific details of it would look like, but you can see, like, for instance, in the Lonzo Ball sign and trade that happened last year, where I'm pretty sure the Pelicans did even want to keep Lonzo. So they would have been willing to match a contract. They only got back Garrett Temple, Thomas Satoransky, and a second round pick. It's not nothing. And that's usually how you look at sign and trades. It's not nothing, but it's certainly not even close to equal. And the reason for that is because of the lack of leverage. In the current NBA, with how empowered players are in free agency, it's hard to make a guy go somewhere he doesn't want to go, especially when he's not even actually on contract. And I think with Ayton, you're going to see something similar. Even though they might get a little bit more than what Lonzo got, I think it'll be relatively similar in terms of how good you feel about it. When you see Woj tweet it out, if it is a sign and trade, the comments are going to call it a fleece. They're not going to like it. The other problem with an Ayton sign and trade is that it's a little tricky because, like, if Ayton wants to go to a team that doesn't have the money, they have to match the salaries, right? Like the Mavs, for example, they don't have the money to straight up sign them salary cap wise, so they have to match the salaries. But then part of the reason why Phoenix isn't re-signing Ayton is because they don't want to take on more money. So how would that work, right? Maybe it would just be like they wouldn't care so much to sign a guy for a couple of years. Like if they had $30 million in extra, salary added to the roster, it's not a big deal if it's only for one season, so it has to be an expirings. Whereas with Ayton, it would be for 5. But it still would put them in the luxury tax, most likely, unless it's like partially guaranteed contracts, which I think the Mavs have some of, or the Hornets have some of, or a team like that. So that'll be something else to watch out for. The logistics of an Ayton sign and trade, if they're not re-signing him because they don't want to take on more money, is tough, because in a sign and trade, you'd probably have to take on more money. But I think a lot of people's biggest question about Ayton is he really like worth a max contract? And my answer would be tentatively yes for some teams and some situations. He is a borderline guy, so naturally like 90% of NBA Twitter is going to say that he's not worth a max contract because Twitter says that most players are overpaid. The thing about Ayton is that currently, like as good as he is right now, if I told you that Ayton was not going to get any better, I don't think a team would. But you have to keep in mind that he's 23 years old, and a lot of teams are going to look at his talent and they're going to say he's already pretty good. We will be willing to take the risk on his development. And even if it doesn't work out, he's still not a terrible player. And maybe it does work out and we've landed ourselves an all-star in free agency. The teams that are going to be willing to take that risk are teams that cannot normally attract a free agent of Ayton's caliber. So a team like Portland is not great at attracting free agents. So them having like salary cap is really not worth all that much, right? Or maybe not that it's not worth that much, but it's not worth as much as maybe another team's is, right? So if they're sitting here saying, well, even if we save our salary cap, we're probably not going to get a better player than Ayton. So we'll offer him the max because we don't want to lose a free agent of his caliber over a couple of $1 million. That'd be stupid for us to do. Same thing with Detroit. Maybe Detroit's not the hottest free agency destination. So if they have a chance to even, roll the dice on a guy who might be an all-star in free agency and is already, a really good player, they're going to be willing to do that. That's absolutely a risk that they're going to be willing to take. And if it doesn't work out, okay, you can figure it out down the line. Or like a team like the Hornets, Deandre Ayton would be their best free agent signing in like team history. That team, we never attract free agents ever. So yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a risk to take Ayton, but less free agency inclined teams are, and smaller market teams are just their salary cap isn't worth as much. So a max contract for the Lakers and a max contract for the Hornets is not worth the same amount. It's not as big of a risk. And I think with Ayton, you're already working on a pretty solid base, honestly, where the floor for him, the reasonable floor, I mean, anybody could get horribly injured, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but I feel like the reasonable floor for him isn't even that bad, you know? So I think that there's definitely some teams that I would consider signing him for a max too. Absolutely. But that being said, I do really understand the concerns with Ayton. And like, absolutely, I do not think it's unreasonable to say that he is not that type of player. The problem with him is that, like, again, he is not dominant on offense. The NBA is an offensive game. He's a good defender. He's a very good defender. He doesn't get played off the court in the playoffs. And really, there's a lot less centers like that than you think. You hear a lot of takes that, oh, centers aren't worth that much. I'd never pay a center over $15 million. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that centers don't matter, which seems to be like a new take. They matter a lot. Interior defense matters a lot. Having an interior defender who can stand up to top guys and doesn't get played off the court in the playoffs and is switchable is absolutely super valuable. And there's just not that many dudes who can do that in the NBA. And with Ayton, I know maybe he doesn't always stand up great to the top guys. He's definitely shaky with that, but he's not incapable of doing it. And that's the same way I feel about him on offense. It's like, he's averaging, he averages close to 20 a game, right? Like he's got some offensive moves. He's great in the pick and roll. Like there's a lot of different things that he can do. But then when you get into like the playoffs and the other team is throwing Maxi Kleber at you, like you need to be able to go and beat that. If you are like really an elite center, that has to be something that the other team cannot do. You cannot let the other team do that. The other team should look at you and say, we can't put him out there. We have to be better, interior in the interior. And with Ayton, he's just not there yet. And maybe he gets there. Maybe he develops. Maybe he needs just a bigger workload and to get into more of the flow and not be a third option. But if he doesn't, like, absolutely, it's not going to be a good contract. If he doesn't develop, absolutely, you're not going to feel great about it. Especially if he goes to a team like the Pistons and he's a second option and he's getting shut down like that. That won't fly. That won't be good enough. So again, he is worth the max. To some teams, it is absolutely worth it. But it is a risk. Like 100%, you need to see the development out of him. So let's talk a little bit about some of the teams that he could possibly go to. And I'm going to start off with the Charlotte Hornets. As a Hornets fan, no team needs a center more. Now, the Hornets don't actually have the salary cap to go out and sign him, but I actually think that it'll be a little bit easier to get off of Gordon Hayward's contract than people expect. They do have some expiring deals. They have PJ Washington. Plumlee is expiring. He's partially guaranteed. Kelly Oubre is partially guaranteed, and he's expiring. So it's workable. The Hornets' perspective right now is they want to keep continuing to get better. And they're kind of at a point where LaMelo Ball's contract extension is going to kick in 2 years if they sign him. And I'm assuming they do, because if they don't, they're screwed anyway, right? So in 2 years, LaMelo Ball's contract extension kicks in. They'll have to pay PJ Washington. They'll have to pay Miles Bridges this offseason. They're already paying Terry Rozier. So what they're looking at is they're looking at that Gordon Hayward contract. They know he's not a long-term piece, and they're going to try to get off of it. And if they get expirings for him this offseason, they'll go into next offseason saying, this is our last year. They'll have a max slot, and it'll be their last year to spend it before all of their money gets locked up by their big contract, core piece players. And they won't really have an option to go out and sign a big free agent anymore. So they're going to be looking to basically sign a guy at any cost, right? They're looking to add one more piece before it's too late. Now, the plan would be for that to happen next offseason because you have to trade Gordon Hayward for expirings. But if there's a way to work signing Ayton this offseason and just having like that be the extra piece that you end up adding and paying, I'm sure the Hornets would be down for that. On top of that, Ayton completely changes their defense. You guys know this Hornets center struggles. A pairing with LaMelo would be awesome. And I think the Hornets are kind of in a spot with their offense where they wouldn't be like, yeah, you would want Ayton to get better And again, it would still be like not a great contract if he didn't continue to improve his offensive game. But if he didn't, like, I don't know if the Hornets would be banking on Ayton becoming like the superstar player. Like, let's say he just stayed the exact same. You would still expect LaMelo to develop and Miles Bridges to develop, and you still have Terry Rozier, so you still have a lot of offense on that team, right? And on top of that, you have 2 first-round draft picks this season and a general manager who's great at drafting, and you have Kai Jones, and you have PJ Washington, you have Bouknight. Those guys can develop. So I think the pressure for Ayton to become a star would not be that high with the Hornets. I think he's probably, again, I said it earlier, I think he'd be the best free agent they pretty much have ever had, unless I'm forgetting somebody. So I would be, as a Hornets fan, I'd be very down. The fit makes a lot of sense. The one thing that is standing in their way is that they're a small market team, and it's tough to attract free agents. Would Ayton pick here? Yeah, if he likes the Hornets culture, which I think is really good, and he likes our coach hiring, and he says, man, if I sign there, they'd be a 50-win team. They'd be really young. They fit my timeline. If he likes all that stuff, and it's totally reasonable to expect him to do it, and the Hornets and Suns can work out some sort of trade, which is totally reasonable, I think it makes perfect sense. As a Hornets fan, I'm just trying not to get my hopes up. But yeah, I think Charlotte makes perfect sense. I think, again, no team needs a center more. Maybe he doesn't end up choosing here, but it's completely reasonable to expect him to. And I don't want to be, this is biased, but if I was him, this is where I'd choose. Maybe I'd choose somewhere. I don't know. I would consider it. It's just a small market problem. But he's already played in Phoenix for 4 years. He doesn't necessarily, there haven't been reports that like he's desperate to play in a big market. So it's reasonable to expect the Hornets to have a genuine shot. A lot of it comes down to just like each individual team's pitch, but I think the Hornets make complete and total sense. The next team is the Mavericks. The Mavericks need interior defense almost as much as the Hornets, right? There would be a little bit more offensive pressure on Ayton in Dallas, maybe, because he'd be maybe more of a second option with the Mavericks. But I think the Mavericks actually have enough offensive pieces where if Ayton wanted to like do more and things were going well with his offensive game and you wanted him to take over more, he could. But if not, I mean, you still have Luka, who is, one of the highest usage rate offensive players in the league. So like you can kind of play it both ways. I don't think that'd be too big of a problem. The one problem that I think the Mavericks are going to have with signing Ayton is that I don't think the Suns are going to let it happen, because the Mavericks don't have the cap space to sign him. And while, again, I said that it is kind of like Ayton just choosing where he wants to play, at the end of the day, Phoenix still could like veto somewhere, and they lost to the Mavericks, and they're like a direct rival. And just because Phoenix isn't getting Ayton back doesn't mean they're still being competitive. So I don't think they're going to want him to go to a Western Conference team, especially a team that's a direct rival now. So I just think that maybe Phoenix wouldn't allow that to happen. If not, totally makes sense as a move. I would worry a little bit that if you're banking on Ayton becoming a second star, that's a pretty big risk, because Luka really deserves a legit second star. And if it doesn't work out with Ayton and his contract, a little bit, I just said with the Hornets, if it doesn't work out and he doesn't get way better, it's not the end of the world, because they're not banking on that. Dallas might be banking on a little bit more for him to step up and really be an elite player. Like the expectation would be for him to be the second best player on a championship team. And I don't know if Ayton's there yet. Another team I saw mentioned today in a tweet is the Spurs. And I don't love them. If I was Ayton, I probably wouldn't pick the Spurs. Now, they can offer him, I believe, straight up. I think they have a way to work themselves to that salary cap if they don't already. But I think the Spurs are maybe a little bit farther away than some of the other options. They're a very well-run team, and maybe you like them for their development. And maybe they'll have a really good pitch. It's totally not unreasonable. But I almost think that the Spurs, because of like they're a little bit farther away, because they don't really have their guy yet the way that the Hornets and the Mavs do, maybe wouldn't want to lock up their money on a risk like Ayton. I also think that San Antonio is maybe a little bit more inclined to attract free agents, so they won't feel as much like they need to go get this guy. So I don't love it. And I honestly think that a lot of Spurs fans wouldn't feel great paying Ayton the max the way that maybe more Hornets fans would or more Mavs fans would. So I'm not like if he picks there, totally get it. I think the one thing that maybe he would like about them is that they could give him a really big workload and he could do a lot more. And if he wants to bet on himself in that sense, that's absolutely a great spot. Maybe that's not the worst decision in the world, but I don't know if they're offering quite as much as some of the other landing spots are. The next one is Detroit. I think they can offer him straight up. They have the salary cap for it. And if he wants to like grow and build with Cade Cunningham, I don't know if I can blame him. And if he signed there, you'd look at that team and you'd say, man, they're really on the up and up. They have the 5th overall pick. Troy Weaver's a really good general manager, I think. So it may come down to a little bit of like, which point guard does he want to play with? Does he want to play with Damian Lillard, possibly Cade, LaMelo, or how much of a role does he want? Because I think Detroit is another team that would expect him to take on a little bit bigger of a role. But you can definitely see the path for Detroit being that team. And if I was them, getting a big free agent like this and taking that risk before Cade Cunningham's extension, I know that's 3 years away, so maybe that's a little bit too far in the future to think. But before you have some of these other guys, like that would give you a real bona fide star next to Cade, and you want to really start building around him. I think it makes perfect sense. Next is Portland. They have a lot of partially guaranteed contracts, so they don't have the cap space currently, I don't think, but like they have players they could cut who would open up a lot of money, so they could. I kind of like Portland. They're another team that's a little bit smaller market, so I think having a chance to land a free agent like this would definitely mean that they're going to offer the max. Portland has decided that they're going to build around Dame again. That's what they're doing, and they're going to go try to build through free agency to do it. A lot of the other options like Bradley Beal and Zach LaVine might not be realistic, and even if they are, it doesn't feel like those would be that big of a change from the Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum duo, right? Plus, you already have Simons, who is, maybe a guy who needs to be resigned, but is also a really good guard. So you already have another guard to pair with Dame. I think Ayton would provide an interior defense that Damian Lillard's been missing. I remember when the Blazers played the Nuggets in the playoffs, how bad. They just couldn't handle Jokic at all. They had no interior defense. They were putting out lineups of Nurkic and Carmelo Anthony, or Cantor and Carmelo Anthony at the 5 and the 4. And that just doesn't fly. And I think they've tried to go out and get like Robert Covington in the past to solve their defensive problems. And a lot of times McCollum and Dame have been like blamed as like, well, that's too bad defensive guards, so that's their problem. But I think it's been the interior defense. So if they have a chance to go get Ayton, and I do think his role would be a little bit bigger on the Blazers than on the Suns, I think that would make total sense. And I wouldn't blame Ayton for signing there either. The other thing is that I like that move for Portland because it kind of gives them an out if the Damian Lillard stuff doesn't work. I know a lot of people are going to sit there and say signing Ayton doesn't make Portland a contender, and I would agree. But Portland is not always been the team to blow it up if they aren't like tracking towards being a contender. I think if they're tracking towards being a playoff team, they're going to accept that. But hear me out. If Portland runs it back with Dame next year, they sign Ayton, and it doesn't work out, they could trade Damian Lillard next offseason, and they'd be building around whatever they got back for Damian Lillard, which would certainly be a lot. Simons, who'd be 24, and Ayton, who'd be 24. That is not a bad start to a rebuild at all. So I think that for Portland, it would be a really strong move. I think for Ayton, it totally could make sense. They desperately need a center. They'd probably offer him the max. He'd probably have a bigger role, be playing with a really good point guard. Would be a smaller market again, but I feel Portland's going to be one of the more aggressive teams in free agency this year. So that's definitely a team I have a star by as one of the more likely options for him. And then the last team I wanted to talk about is the Hawks, and what they've got going for them, maybe that other teams don't so much that we've talked about before, is that they're a very big market. And NBA players do care about that a lot. It's tough to tell who cares about it. Some players do, some players don't. But if Ayton does, be a big deal. Be playing with a really good point guard, and he'd be on a very competitive team that had made the conference finals recently. I think the expectation for him, though, would be that he'd be that second star, right? And he would have to take on a pretty decent offensive workload, even though they've got Trae Young doing a lot there. And then the sign and trade would be, something that you'd have to work out with Atlanta as well. There's a lot going on if he's going there, right? But honestly, I think that their sign and trade options to match salary are pretty strong. Like it'd be Clint Capella and maybe Herter. Like that would be pretty strong in terms of a sign and trade for the Suns. So I think they'd be down to do that. It'd be, again, big market, good point guard, good team. You would be like, the expectations probably would be a little bit higher for him because they're a team that's really desperately trying to find that second star, because they don't feel like they have it right now to put around Trae Young. But on top of that, their defense has been a huge problem, and Ayton is a pretty good defensive center, so they'd be expecting a ton out of him. The expectations would be very high. But you can totally see why Ayton would want to sign there as well. So looking at those 6 teams, if I had to pick the team that I think is the favorite, I might go with the Hawks because they kind of have everything. I think the Suns would be eager to trade him there because they'd give him a pretty good package as far as sign-in trades go. It's the biggest market. It's a very good team. He would have a very big role on that team, and I think he wants a bigger role. I think he does. So it would just come down to whether or not they're willing to offer him the max. But if they are, they kind of got everything going for him. After that, I'd say Detroit and Portland are 2 teams that I think are very likely to offer him a max contract and don't even need to really pull off some sort of like weird sign-in trade to get it done. So I'd say they're kind of in the next tier below the Hawks. Below that, then I'd have the Hornets. Makes sense. Really good option for Ayton, but the sign-in trade is maybe a little bit tougher to work out. And then below that, I'd have the Mavs and the Spurs, who are definitely possible, but I'd say a little bit even less likely. So Hawks, Portland, Detroit, Hornets, Spurs, Mavs. But that about wraps it up for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all the stuff you're supposed to do on YouTube videos. And I'll catch you guys next time.